Thomas, thank you for being here. This is the first in a series of Q&As that I want to do with people to bring in other perspectives from people that I know or whose work I know, to kind of broaden the lens a little bit and make it so that it's not just me talking. And I'm delighted to have you as the first person that is joining me for these. And just to give background, you and I met in the late '90s in New York, working at Siegel and Gale at a very particular moment in time in I think the development of how brands are built and understood. We then became business partners at 1066 Group 1066 in New York, and we had a wild ride there. And then you've gone off since then, first at Avid, and then at Landor, the largest, I think, branding firm in the world, where you were the chief strategy officer until last year when you left to start your own business, Ordahl Co., which I'm sure we'll also talk about. And so you're also, one of the smartest people I know, and certainly the best brand strategist I know. And it's always really fun to get your perspectives, and I always learn a lot. So thank you for being here.
Thank you for inviting me.
We won't do too much of the ancient history, the old guys reminiscing about the world as it was before. But I'd love to start at the beginning of when we started out. Just New York in the '90s, so the dot-com era, and brand was changing, right? And I'd love to just kind of get your perspective on why that moment was such a pivot in the way that that brands in particular, are created and exist in the world.
Yeah, I mean, it was a really frothy time, and I always joke that I'm like kind of an interloper into the brand world. I sort of snuck in through at the time I was a digital strategist, which now is kind of funny to think back on, but at the time I was a digital strategist and entered Siegel and Gale as that, and then from there kind of learned about brand and then became a brand strategist. But I sort of came in through the back door,
Mm.
and really I think my original sort of interest in brand was, we were, the thing about the dot-com thing is you were building things, you were building businesses, you were building platforms. Websites were meant to do something, right? They were meant to, either they were transactions or they were relationship building, they're providing new services, they're replacing analog services with digital services. And
Mm.
so there was a sense of making something. And what I loved about that, and where I think it was a pivot, and you saw this tension in the people we worked with who came out of a more traditional brand background, was, and maybe I'm overstating things, but I will anyway. The old world of brand pre.com was very much, it was a graphics business. It was making design systems and logos, and it was very visual, voice, writing, but it was communications. It was meant to shape communications. And I think what was very exciting about the time that you and I started up in the world was it was actually about, brand was beginning to govern a much broader set of considerations, how something worked, what was the checkout experience, what was the UX experience. There was we had a lot of, information designers and user experience designers. We were contemplating brands in the context of a much broader set of considerations with a more diverse team of people that were all building this thing, right? So I think what it did for a lot of us is opened up our minds to the power of brand to be a rubric to drive much more than just comms. And look, that was always true, but really came into play, I think, coming out of the dot-com era, where it was like, wait, this brand thing actually can be a governing tool or a framework for decision making for almost every aspect of a business. And that was a very exciting sort of moment to sort of step into it. It got me very excited about the promise of this working in this industry.
It also forced companies, I think, to really consider their identity, because you had a website, which at the time was 640 by 480 pixels. It was very, very small. And
Right.
the entire company had to funnel in through that thing. And so all of a sudden you had to decide what is the navigation? What
What's
these
the
three
most
things?
important thing? Yeah. Yeah.
What
Yeah.
what
That's a
matters?
great point. Yeah. It's a great point. Because before the internet, again, we sound like ancient times, but
Right.
it was rare to experience a brand in one experience. It was like brands were diffused across lots of unrelated touch points. So that aggregation of all of that and concentration to one application was also, yes, I think that's a great point, was a very new thing and forced a lot of difficult decisions and difficult considerations for businesses, because there was nowhere to hide.
Yeah, until that time, it was kind of the annual report. That was the only thing, right?
Right.
And an organization, they would spend a huge amount of money putting out a physical annual report, and that was the only time, that you actually had to do that. You had to actually
Right.
have one unified view of what the organization was.
Right.
So then, fast forwarding a little bit, going from the '90s to the aughts, we then had our business, had Group 1066,
Yeah.
which was a heady time, and one that, I think for me certainly formed. That was really the time when I kind of formed a lot of my opinions and my theories, and you and I together, not just me, us, we were kind of
Yeah.
creating a lot of that. Maybe share a little bit of perspective on what that was like.
I laugh often. I guess I'll tell stories or like remember things we said. And one of the things I remember us saying, I don't remember who said it, was either you or me first, but if you're having problems writing your value proposition, how about creating some value?
Right? That was
And that was
yeah,
sort of, I think, kind of the raison d'etre, if I'm pronouncing my
yeah,
French is terrible. You could almost distill, I think, our motivation onto that. I think at its worst moments, and I don't want to be cynical, but at its worst moments, branding at its worst can be, performing a sophistry to try to make something that's not that great sound better than it is, which never works. And I never tried, and I don't do it. I refuse to do it. But, you could sort of say cynically that's branding at its worst. But I also think conversely, I think we saw the opportunity to look at innovation and product development through the lens of brand. So, we weren't doing, for the most part, we did some brand programs and identities, things like that. But mostly we were focused on how is brand going to inform innovation, product roadmaps, product development, and all of that, which we may have been slightly ahead of our time on that one. I don't know. But it did. We did great work. But I think the fact that we were so rooted in, how is this going to show up in the actuality of the business in terms of the offer, the service, how it's being delivered, how they're changing, evolving their services and innovating, that we were always looking at it through that lens, kind of coming off of that comment I made before about .com and how it was about building stuff. I think we
yeah.
had a kind of bias, we had that bias built in versus again, just doing sort of comms oriented positioning and messaging. So anyway, to me, that was the sort of, that was our rallying cry and that was our purpose. And it was amazing for a while.
Until it wasn't.
Yeah. Till
Yeah,
2008. And, yeah.
I think that it's still very hard to get people to think about brands in that way. Almost 20 years later, people don't. That's not the first way that people think about brand, is as a frame for decision making about how innovation should work or about how an organization should work. Or do you not agree? I mean, do you think that
I'm not
that's
sure I
something?
agree. I mean, like, I think it's varying degrees. I think what's almost interesting, how do I explain this? I think that there's businesses that are struggling with innovation. And I think they maybe have a hard time seeing how to connect brand as a way to drive and refresh and renew their approach to innovation.
Mhm,
Yes. Then there's, interestingly, the businesses that don't even really talk about brand,
mhm.
but their brand is so hardwired into their DNA that it actually informs all their innovation. Dyson being probably the best example, where, as I understand, I think Dyson's sort of hostile towards the B word. But in a sense, there's no business that is more informed by a central guiding set of principles. I mean, I think it's very clear. And as a buyer, Elsa just got their hair dryer, which costs like a fortune, and she's been raving about it. But it's interesting as you look at their evolution of that business, how at the core, there's something at the center of Dyson, which is very clear, governs their innovation, their product development process, their packaging, their voice. It's brand, whether he likes it or not. That is brand at its best. So, and I certainly
Well,
have
you
a
said
lot of,
something very important. Is it easier if you have a founder who is
yes,
very
yeah, yeah,
much
yeah.
making those decisions? Because that,
But
does
Apple
focus.
Apple has carried on, and the app
True.
and I would say, well, and I would say Disney. Everyone has their fits and starts, but Disney is certainly, and again, another one where I find
Yeah.
the people I've ever known that were part of the Disney organization, like, and this is not, executives. This could be people that are just in the service experience at the parks and all that.
Yeah.
The brand is like, it's in the DNA. It's almost on a subconscious level. There's such an understanding of what the brand is that So that's one of the interesting things, the businesses that are very, that are very brand led. It's often kind of almost hardwired. It's almost reptilian brain level, you know.
Yeah.
To get to
Yeah.
that is possible, but that's a lot of work. So it's a funny thing. I think that the people that don't get it, it's hard. The people that get it, it's there, you
I
know.
remember being at Microsoft, and when Microsoft had the stores, it was a very different thing hiring people into to work in the stores versus you'd kind of cross the mall over to the Apple store, and the people who were there in the Apple store inherently understood what it was. They were the real hardcore fans. They loved the products, they loved the company, they loved the brand. And not only did they love it, they understood it because they grew up with it and
Right.
they had internalized it. Microsoft wasn't as easy to build that sort of culture. We talk about culture and the role of brands in culture in these large organizations all the time. The retail experience was an opportunity for the public to walk in and to see it on display in a way that
Right.
you can't walk into corporate HQ and go sit down in the
Right.
cafeteria or pop your head into a meeting. But you can definitely do it in the retail. So in terms of how you help companies, other organizations to foster those sorts of cultures where the brand is understood at that fundamental level so that it can be a tool for understanding, if this is who we are, this is what we do and how we do it. Can you talk a little bit about how you can build that?
I mean, it's very similar to culture broadly. It's just to what extent is it being led by brand, and in terms of culture, meaning employee culture. I mean, a lot of it is it's so interesting to work. We've all worked in big companies and see culture, like what are the things people think they have permission to do, and what are the things they don't think they have permission to do, right? What are the no's that they're telling themselves and the yeses they're telling themselves, and how are things done around here? Kind of as someone I worked with once
Right.
said, that's kind of the definition of culture, and and most of that's my experience is reinforced through micro decision making all the time. And
Mhm.
you can talk up here about, this is the things we stand for, these are our values, but if it's not being applied and evidenced in practice on a frequent basis, it doesn't happen. And that's where it tends to fall down. And so, well, there has
Mhm.
to be two things. One is we have to really believe in the things that we're saying,
Mhm.
and then we have to apply them. And we have to apply them on an ongoing and consistent basis. And we have to get rid of people or whatever that aren't applying them. And we have to call out
Mhm.
when we've missed them. And we have to, so it takes a kind of constant reinforcement on a micro basis, is where I see it work the best. And that starts with the top. It starts with the CEO, because we've all known leaders that, make a claim and then they, in practice, they go against it. And me, that just kills the whole thing. I mean, that then there's, so it has to be, so they that leader sets the tone, and then it has to be applied consistently. And when that begins to happen, then it becomes part of the operating framework and the DNA of the organization. But it happens in thousands and thousands of micro moments, micro decisions. I mean,
Mhm.
having led teams, over the years, large practices and all that, I've seen so much of how, the culture of the team and all that. It's really cultivated and sustained through lots of tiny decisions, micro behaviors that you're seeing evidence countless times a day. And
Mhm.
are people lined up around what's important? What do we stand for in those moments? I think that's the most important thing. So I think it's the human behavior of, don't eat that mushroom. It's poisonous. I mean, we all, and a lot of it's, I think, an interesting dimension, not to get too esoteric, but
Let's get
is how,
esoteric.
huh?
Let's get
Let's go. I
esoteric.
know you love getting esoteric. All right. So, yeah, getting esoteric. So, one of the things that's interesting is how much of and I think this does relate to the deep esoteric side of brand, is the role of memory. You could almost ask yourself, are brands only remembered?
Mhm.
And because a lot of it is the memory, and I think that goes back to just human behavior, going back thousands, millions of years, is you remember the last time you ate that mushroom, you got sick, right? Or somebody died. So
Right.
avoid red mushrooms or whatever it is, or,
Right.
um, or the last time, then you get into superstitions, the last time that bird crossed, over in front of us, a
Right.
tornado came or something. I don't know, whatever these things, or the full moon always does this, or whatever these
Yeah.
things. And
Pattern.
so pattern
Right.
recognition. So humans are very good at
Right.
pattern recognition, and they're good at
Yeah.
and our memory, and we compose memory. That memory can be positive or negative. Oh, it was whenever that red mushroom is really dangerous, or but the blue mushroom is delicious, and we had the best dinner of our life when we picked those blue mushrooms. And so you're going, so I think brands are almost memory keepers. And what this, so you think like, oh, I should buy, because we all have that. Like we'll be in the market to buy, I don't know, like a white goods product that you almost never buy. Let's say, once every 20 years or 10 years, you get a new washing machine. You probably are pulling in, they've done a lot of studies on this. You're pulling in the memories from when you were a kid. Like, what did your parents buy? Or like tires or auto insurance is a big one like that. A lot of the insurance products where, well, my dad was always a State Farm guy, and so I'll be a
Right.
State Farm guy. And like I trust it,
Right.
even though it's a very old memory.
Right.
I think it's a very interesting part of the nature of branding. So now here's what happens though, is you have a memory, so you've got a fixed idea. This is what, the Plaza Hotel, in New York, it's in the movies and it's fancy. And I have this vision in my mind, what's going to be, and I'm going to go there and we're going to have this experience like I've seen so many times. And then the experience doesn't match it. Right.
Yeah.
And that's the breakdown that can happen. Or it changes it or exceeds it. And it can go in different directions. It can match it, but push it a little bit. Like, oh, I knew it was old fashioned, but now it's a little bit cooler or whatever. Or,
Right.
geez, this is the Plaza. I thought the Plaza was a real fancy hotel, or, whatever those things are. Right. So
Right.
we're carrying, and that's one of the tensions of brand management, right? Is you have to honor some of the memories, and that, gets into a whole area which I don't ever know a ton about, but I always find endlessly fascinating, is semiotics, which I think is a really interesting kind of subset of the branding world. What are these associations we carry around that build mental models that you need to, as a brand, deliver on? Like fancy 5-star hotel, there's certain semiotics they're expecting. I used to joke a bidet in the bathroom was like a semiotic cue for a 5-star European hotel, even though I think most people never touch a bidet, but it's got to
Right.
be there, or else I don't think it's
Nice
a
to
fancy
have it
hotel.
though.
You know, I'm walking around Paris all day in the summer, but it's, so there are these mental images that we carry, which you have to both not violate, but often you have to then also learn how to move them or adapt them or evolve them, or, how do you take, the Tiffany blue box and bring it into the digital world? Or how do so all those, and I think that's a very interesting area, right? But it goes back to the esoteric part of it. It goes back to memory. And the brands, I think we all as humans carry around a storehouse of memories. A lot of people's dreams, like when they envision, like, I mean, often you think about like a vacation you want to go on. Like, say you want to go to Cape Cod, and you went to Cape Cod when you were a kid, when you were like 11, and they're going to go bring your kids there now.
Right.
It may come down to like, I just want to go to an ice cream stand and eat in the hot sun on the sand or whatever. I want to eat an ice cream cone and a clam. You might, the whatever, the tens of thousands of dollars you've spent to make this Cape Cod vacation happen might, for you, really, if you think about it, come down to, I want to have this one moment of eating an ice cream cone with my kids like I did when I was 11, and it was so fabulous and so great, and it's this memory I carry around with me.
Yeah.
So I think
Which
memory
is,
is a really interesting area to probe in the analysis of the sort of esotericness of brands,
right.
because they're
Right.
mental models. Brands are mental models we carry around, and they have to be fulfilled. They have to be pushed. And that's that's the tension. That's the give and take of brand management, relevant, differentiated, but not losing the equities you've built, but also not just resting on them. You gotta, as I always say, brands, you have to stand for something, but never stand still. They have to move. They got to adapt and change. And
Yeah. And trying to do that for something that is recognized by millions of people or billions of people, but then everyone has a very subjective experience, right? I mean, that memory is my memory. It's not your memory, right? You have a different memory.
well, this is
That's
one of my
true.
other esoteric views, and I think it's one of my kind of predict. I mean, I think it's true now. I think it's always been true, but I think it's going to become more true in the future. Is who owns brands? Brands more and more, I
Yeah.
think, will be owned
Yeah.
by their customers more than by the brand itself. Like,
Yeah. That's already,
and that's already really true, and it's getting
we're
even
there.
more. And I think it's going to go. I wrote an article about it a number of years ago about. I think brands might be like memes in the future.
Like what?
like memes where they get created,
Yeah.
or you think back to like, you kind of dating us as two old heads, but think back to like the Dead when we were like in the Grateful
Oh
Dead
yeah.
when we were, there was a whole culture, there were habits, there were norms, there were clothes, there were, I mean, it was a whole little micro cultural economic system.
Language,
Yeah.
products, the whole.
Products, behaviors, I mean,
Yeah.
everything. Food,
Yeah.
food they would eat. I mean,
Yeah.
I remember
Yeah.
you went to Dead shows in the 80s and 90s. I mean, it was like a whole, like you were joining into this, like you were visiting a foreign country, and
Yeah.
where did that come from? How did that? No one set
Yeah.
those rules, but
Right.
what was interesting is you had businesses started selling into it, and
Yeah.
so I think that's going to become, and I think it's happening now. I mean, again, I wrote this thing, I'll send it to you again. I wrote it a number of years ago, but that the world is going to start, businesses will start actually selling into brands, and then the buyers will then be the arbiters of whether it's on brand or off brand. So in order to,
Yeah.
like, if you want to start selling, I don't know, Grateful Dead, start selling t-shirts, tie dyes, you better make sure it's like, right, you're really understanding the nuances of that culture you're trying to sell into.
Yeah.
Or, I mean, I think one of the most brilliant brand builders of all time, one of my favorite brand people of all time, is Jimmy Buffett.
Mhm.
I mean, one of the greatest, I mean, incredible. The whole Parrot Head. I mean, he sold retirement villages. I mean, he turned
Yeah.
that brand.
Margarita
Yeah,
bills.
Margaritas was one in Times
Yeah.
Square. I mean, it's like,
Yeah.
he turned that thing into, I mean, it's one of the most successful, fascinating brand stories of all time. I mean, but again, how much did he sit down and write out? Like, this was a kind of co-created thing where he was as much a participant as he was a
Yeah.
controller of it, right? And so his
Yeah.
audience, all those parrot heads, all those people living into this dream of, being a beach bum and whatever. I mean, that whole kind of thing, that fantasy that
Yeah.
he came out of a song,
Yeah.
was as much theirs as it was his, right? I mean, the parrot heads own it as much as he does, right? So that's a world I think that's only going to get more true.
Yeah. No, it's this whole like the Scottish philosopher from the 18th century, Adam Ferguson, part of the Scottish Enlightenment, had this idea of spontaneous order, which are things that are they're the outcome of human action, but not human design. And like language,
Yeah,
right? The English language, we don't have, there's no central committee deciding what the English language is or what is allowed in English or not allowed. I mean, yes, you
right.
annoy your English teacher, but it evolves organically. And this is, I think, one of the most interesting areas of innovation and how new things can get created now.
Totally agree.
Um,
Yeah,
open source software is an example of that. Where people are, there's no company, or I mean, I think crypto, the way that these crypto brands, which are created not because there's some central marketing committee for Bitcoin or Ether or whatever. It's these communities that have built up around it, and then they become the marketing organization for it. Thank you so much for watching part 1 of my conversation with Thomas Ordahl. Again, if you want to reach Thomas, he is thomas@ordahlco.com. We're going to have part 2 of the conversation next week, where we'll get into the current state of brand and kind of look ahead a little bit into the future. Thanks again. And let me know what you think. This is the first of a series of Q&As that I want to do. And if you've got ideas or thoughts or feedback, I would love to hear from you. Thanks so much.